Hello, folks. Welcome to today's presentation. Good afternoon. Our presentation today is titled, Is EDI Dead? Navigating the Future of EDI, Challenges and Opportunities. My name is Danette Starblanket. I'm from the Starblanket Cree Nation, and I'm an assistant professor here at Johnson Choyama Graduate School, Regina Campus. JSGS. I am pleased to welcome you to today's event as the moderator. The Johnson Choyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. And our attendance here today is a prime example, proof in the pudding of that. I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories. The original lands of the Cree, Ojibwa, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We're glad to welcome those of you joining us today from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land you reside on and think about and express gratitude for the place and the people who have taken care of it throughout time. If you so choose, you are also welcome to share your own land acknowledgement in the chat. And as we consider our coexistence together, please think about actions we can identify to actively engage in reconciliation to honor the land and its people and our place here. For those of you who may be new to the EDI discussion series, I'm pleased to welcome you today. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector. This series is proudly supported by the Max Bell Foundation, who encourages the development of forward-looking innovations that impact public policies and practices. If you'd like more information on the Max Bell Foundation and their work, please click the link in the chat. Today's discussion will focus on the future of EDI. Our diverse community has looked forward to engaging in this relevant topic related to EDI. We are prepared to be enlightened from this discussion with all of you here today. It's timely and extremely necessary. There are currently a lot of changes happening in various parts of the world related to EDI, and many people ponder the future of diverse thinking and acting. We are honored to have Dr. Stryker Calvez with us to generate this discussion. We want to acknowledge that we will be having an open yet respectful conversation here today. We understand that this is a difficult subject with multiple perspectives on either side, on every side. So I will remind you that what we are doing is initiating a constructive conversation that is meant to help people explore what could happen to support diverse communities in the future. Please recognize that we want to create a safe space for a brave conversation. So I ask you to respect one another's perspectives while treating each other with kindness, dignity, and grace, and being present throughout our discussion. Our speaker will be sharing information on topics that may trigger or re-stimulate trauma to those attending today's event. We recognize the need for safety measures to minimize the risks associated with triggering. If you are experiencing distress as a result of this presentation, please look in the Zoom chat for a list of resources, or alternatively, if you have resources that you can reach out to, please do so. So Karen has added that in our chat for us. Please have a look at that. To help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off their video during the first part of our event. Please feel free to turn your videos back on for the Q&A, or if you so choose during. For the format for today's event is as follows. Following speaker introductions, I'll pose some questions to our panelists, to Stryker, that will help us dig into some of the broader issues. This will give you, our audience, time to come up with questions for today's speaker, as following this, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please use Zoom's chat function to send your question to me, to myself, Danette Starblanket. I've got my chat open and trying my best to keep an eye on it. And I'll pose your question to our panelists. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during today's event. If you have any logistical questions during today's event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen Jaster-LaForge via Zoom's chat or email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. You will be able to find Karen's contact information in the chat as well. Please note that as with all of our EDI presentations, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSG website at a later date. Now that the logistics have been covered, I'm pleased to introduce you to today's speaker. Dr. Stryker Calvez is the Director of Reconciliation, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the City of Saskatoon. Dr. Stryker Calvez is a Métis, Michif researcher, educator, and activist from the Red River Territory around Winnipeg. Over the last 20 years, he has worked extensively with provincial governments, post-secondary institutions, and community organizations to better understand how to implement and/or improve educational, social, and health and well-being programming for Indigenous peoples, newcomers to Canada, and historically disadvantaged populations. He's often recognized as a strong contributor to these stakeholders who are building better relationships with Indigenous peoples, supporting diversity and inclusion management, and facilitating effective intergroup relations. Welcome to our speaker. I'm pleased to start the discussion with our first question. Welcome, Stryker, and thank you for being here. To begin, can you let us all know what brought you to the EDI space and the work you do? This will help give people some perspective on your take about the EDI space. Stryker.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us. I'm glad to have so many people who are interested in this topic, recognizing that it does impact all of us in one way or another. I also want to thank you for starting us off in a good way by recognizing both my ancestors and your own as their original owners, and not owners, but original people of this land. I come by this work very honestly, and I want to be careful to say here that I think everybody comes to this work in one way or another if you really want to look for this opportunities. I myself am diverse. I am neurodiversity. I have a learning disorder that has sort of impacted me throughout my life, and at one point in time was a challenge, and I needed support to get through that. Once I had that support, it became an advantage. I have family members that have neurodiversity, that have different mental health challenges. I have racially different cousins and uncles and aunts. I have a huge amount of diversity right inside my family, and that is not a weakness, it is a strength. And I've always sort of been recognizing the fact that because of all those perspectives, all those lived experiences, I think I'm a better person for all that experiences. And then I think about my children. My children have friends that come from all over the world. They come from different experiences, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and they want to have a safe world in which they can play and then eventually one day grow and become adults and contributing members of society. So my interest in EDI isn't just about my family, it's also about people I work with. I work for the city of Saskatoon, and it is a very highly diverse community of people who come to try to work really hard to make the city a very strong place, a safe place, and a successful place. And I'm really happy and glad to be working with those individuals, helping them make Saskatoon a great place to be. And I want to do the best I can. And so all of this brings me to this place in time right now where we're here speaking about EDI and the importance of it, because it's not just a topic of interest, it's a way of life for me. I think it's a way of life for many people. And I really want to make that as easy as possible so that people can live barrier-free and have a good life and explore the opportunities that might be before them. So the work I do is honest, it's meaningful, and it's personal, both professionally and at the center of who I am. So I'm really glad to be here having this conversation with you.
And thank you so much for that background, that uh, opportunity for us to be able to position where your voice is coming from. That's so incredibly important. And when we recognize and look at equity, diversity, and inclusion, it really is about seeing people, right? And seeing people where they come from, where they're standing. And a lot of that has to do with our history, our family, our experience, etc. So really appreciate that grounding for us.
Well, can I just add that it's also about not only seeing them, it's about letting them be, right? You can see somebody and not allow them to be who they are. And I think that is where the injustice comes from. And I think I take that from the ancestors, but also from the elders who taught me that you give people their autonomy to grow and to be who they are. And I think that's one of the lessons that I bring into the city and the work that I do, is to allow people to be, but also to see them.
Yeah. And it's even, I think, more sometimes than the thinking about allowing, it's making that space. And that's what you're talking about, really making that space. I remember having conversations some decades ago about just terminology and the way that we approach things and the way we think about things. And when folks are thinking about helping others, etc., using, for example, that kind of language, it positions folks in different places. So just even understanding how language can be so powerful, right? And giving people that space. So
Yeah,
important.
safe space.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to move to the million-dollar question now, why we're here, the big one. Is EDI dead? Why did you title the presentation in this way, Stryker?
Well, I think we're in a really very difficult moment, right? I think a lot of things happening in the United States right now. There's been a bit of a shift in change in their engagement in EDI. I think in the States they call it DEI. And I think what's really important here is I think it's causing a ripple effect here in Canada. We are not the United States. I do not have the same concerns I do for the American people as I do for Canadians. But I think it's still on our mind, and I think it's created a little bit of apprehension, a little bit of nervous energy, and I think people are worried. They're worried about what's going to happen here with such a strong reaction in the United States. And so when I put this out there, I wasn't really trying to catastrophize the idea of EDI. What I really want to do is tap into what people are thinking. And I just want to reiterate that EDI is not dead, and I don't think it will die. It's been going on for a number of years. Goes on beyond most people's expectations. But I think in the United States, they're in a real battle for figuring out what is that going to be next. And I think it's going to lead to some really difficult conversations, and I think some difficult decisions, and people are going to have to decide what they want to do. And so by titling it this way, I really just wanted to tap into the concerns that people have. But what I really want to reiterate now that we're all here is that I do not think that there's any concern about EDI disappearing. They may change, and I think change is great. I think change allows us to grow, right? And that's really important. When you have a social movement, a political movement, any type of movement, you want it to grow, which means you have to adapt and you have to change with the times, with the new languages, with the new ideas, right? And that's both informed by research as well as practice, right? And so we have to blend that, and we learn from our experiences of doing this work. And so if we don't have those moments where we can learn, where we can understand and grow from it, I think we put ourselves at a disadvantage. So I think that's really important for us to do that work. And this is what this conversation is really about.
No, I really appreciate that. And again, we we're not catastrophizing it.
It's a tough word. I had to
It
speak notes.
is. I'm bad with big words. And we're, in that sense, either, but you're absolutely right. I think all of us are saying, what is the future? What's going to happen here? Because we know, as people in Canada, as Canadians, and I'm careful again about language, how I use language,
Yeah.
particularly as a First Nations person. When we think about what might happen here, how we generally in Canada tend to, history-wise anyway, historically speaking, we've tended to follow, in not all regards, but in some regards, what the US is doing. And some have gone as far as to say our big brother or what have you. I don't dare use that language now, given where we all are and how we've really usurped that national sense, right?
Yeah.
But I think so many folks are really, really concerned, really afraid, really looking to, and I don't want to put again, language into people's mouths. Some may be excited to see what's going to happen. Who knows, various feelings that are out there. And I really appreciate you talking about that future and saying, I don't, you don't see it happening. Personally,
Well,
I don't either. I really don't. But I want to follow up with that, Stryker. Do you think that regionally there might be some differences, like say from urban to rural places, et cetera, or across Canada, different provinces, territories? Do you think
yeah.
you might see some difference there?
Well, I'm going to broaden that. I'm going to include the United States in this. I picked this topic well before Trump became president. I think it was back in the fall, because I think I was reading the tea leaves back then, and I've been watching this movement in the United States for a long time. Because, as you said, Canada is strongly influenced by what happens in the United States. And so, as a person who cares about his community and cares about the well-being, it's really important to sort of keep your eye on the horizon, right? Like I learned from my Métis elders, right? Is if you can see the storm coming, then you can prepare for it. And so I've been watching the United States for a long time. There's a lot of things happening there, both in a good way, which they come with innovations and best practices, but as well as recognizing where there was this anti-EDI movement happening. And I think what's people are surprised by is the fact that we, as a Canadians, we have a really strong sense of community, right? And I think that comes from a rural community, right? We are a smaller country. We have a really strong rural background, and as someone who grew up in a small community, I remember having to get into truck and drive 10 kilometers to help somebody with a flat tire, or taking a day off to help somebody with combining or swathing, and engaging with support, right? And communities thrive because they support each other, right? And those small communities, you might not get along with somebody, but you still support them because the community is your lifeblood. And I think I learned that as well from my Indigenous community, right? Is that we rely on each other, we support each other because we are a community first and foremost. And then because of that, we have safety and security that supports us. And so I see that as really one of Canada's virtues and values, is this sense of community, sense of connectedness. And I think with the harsh winters here, we all have gotten out of our car and helped somebody push them out of a snowdrift or so forth, right? And you don't stop to think about it, you just stop and do it, right? And that's kind of who we are as Canadians. And I think that's true. I think in the United States, though, there's been a lot of complexity. And the United States has been having these conversations for the longest time, right? The whole country started as an act of rebellion against oppression, right? They've rebelled against the British originally, right? And wanted to create their own space and safe space where all men were created equally, I think is written in their constitution. And from there, they've continued to have this battle, right? And they've actually had a civil war about the abolishment of slavery. And then later on, you had the civil rights movement, right? As they moved towards improvement, which then led to the idea of equal opportunity and affirmative rights, and so forth. And then later in the 90s, more towards accessibility, recognizing people with different abilities and so forth. So the United States has been in this conversation for 300 years, right? If you think about it, or almost 300 years. My math is a bit off here. But the idea here is that they've been doing this work for a long time. So seeing this shift in the last little bit, I think is a bit of a surprise, right? Because the momentum has been going the other way. But it comes from, I think, an honest place. And I think this is going to come as a bit of challenge, right? But I think what's happening in the United States is we had a real improvement. We had a lot of academic research, building towards better understanding how societies have excluded certain communities of people, have created those injustices, those imbalances, those structural imbalances, and created a way of oppressing people for the benefit of others. And in those conversations, as we developed our understanding of it, and as we tried to communicate and share that with others, what I think was difficult in the United States, and I bring this to the forefront because I think it's important for here in Canada. But what happened in the United States is that there was a group of people who felt left out and excluded. And I'm not saying not going to say yes or no whether that was the right thing to do because that's in the past. But what I will recognize is when people are excluded, when they don't know what to do and they don't know where they belong after having a life where they thought they could predict the future, it creates a level of uncertainty, which can be feel life-threatening. I believe the fear of uncertainty is one of the biggest strengths or biggest fears that people have. Babies as young as 6 months start to have that fear of uncertainty, right? So it's a primal fear. And when you have a primal fear that strong, it impacts you. When you feel it, it can feel like your identity, who you are, is being attacked, right? And then it's a life or death situation. And so I'm just suggesting that what happens when we leave people excluded, and as people who have been oppressed as my community, right? I've had to deal with this myself, but I also have empathy for what that feels like and the sense of loss and fear that and uncertainty that it creates. And so I want to say that in the States, I think while we were pushing towards a progressive, better, stronger understanding of what had been happening to people, the oppression that had been happening and the challenges that had been placed on us, I think we inevitably excluded a group of people who should have been in these conversations. We should have spent a little bit more time trying to work with them to better understand how they could be a part of this conversation in a safe way, like we're doing today, right? To better understand that work. And when we left them excluded, they ended up filling the blanks. And this is where they had to defend, right? And again, this comes back to that life-threatening fear. And what they did is they created a strong defense against it, where they started to co-opt some of the conversations that we were having about racism and oppression, and they used that as an explanation for how they were feeling and what was going on. And in doing so, really negated a lot of the momentum that was happening until we got to today, right? So that social movement then became an educational movement, as you saw people at parent-teacher interviews. This is going back almost a decade to 2010 or more, starting to fight for their rights to feel whole, right? Feeling like they were part of the community, right? Which then led to a lot of political activization. And you had conservative politicians recognizing that this was a tool that they could use to sort of build political power and movement. And then that's then moved towards becoming more of a national political issue. And of course, we've got states. I think there's 30 different states that have sort of engaged in deactivating EDI as much as they can. So I bring all that to the attention here that this has been happening for well over a decade. And I've been watching it happen, and I recognize that it's a challenge and it's something we need to be aware of, not in the sense of a fear-based awareness, but in a sense that we don't want to repeat the mistakes that other people have done. And I think today's conversation really should be about how do we do this together, all of us, have those brave conversations, respect and value people, and really move towards creating a society where everybody feels like they're included, not just some groups of people, not just groups of people with lots of socioeconomic status, but everybody has to feel like they're part of this community. We want to create cohesion. We don't have to agree with each other. In fact, it's more fun when we don't agree, right? It makes conversations a little bit more dynamic, but we definitely want to respect and be kind to each other. Sorry, that
Yes.
was a long-winded region. So now we get back to Canada, and I do think there are going to be differences. I do think across Canada, there are different social movements, different values, different beliefs from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I think they bring to these conversations different ideas. But I think what's important is that we're still having these conversations and we're still working together as a community of people and maybe as a family of provinces and regions, sharing and respecting each other without disrespecting or negating other people or excluding them. I think that's really important.
Yes, absolutely. And I've seen that discussion happen before, whereas we've seen the pushing away, pushing down of EDI initiatives as a result of, in response to, I suppose I should say, the promotion of it and the movement of it. So I guess what I'm saying is, and I think this is where we're going with that, where you went with that is that push forward of EDI in many ways, in many spaces, in darker spaces, if you will, I'll use that language, forced it back, right? In some ways. And so certain cohorts of peoples within certain regions, and we see that, I think, Stryker here in Canada, right?
Yeah,
Some
100%.
would say, we see more in certain regions, certain provinces. I mean, they've done some statistical gathering now as to say how many folks this whole idea of even just becoming the 51st state, right? How many folks are in line with that? And it's surprising if Saskatchewan, Alberta, particularly, right? So regionally, we do know we differ across, and that's why I think it's important for us to have had that discussion.
100%. And you think about it, we've lived with the United States our whole entire lives, right? So we do share values and we share beliefs, right? And so there is an affinity with some of the challenges and experiences that are happening in the States. But I think we have to remember that we do come from a different place. We do have a different makeup, right? What can happen in the United States can't necessarily happen in Canada. And I think people don't recognize that. I think there's a little bit of, maybe it's just a lack of awareness and so forth, but we have our Indigenous rights and reconciliation. We have our Canadian Cultural Act. We have our Employment Equity Act. We have Canadian Human Rights Act. We have so much structure built into it. And there's a huge difference between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in Canada, where I believe it's about good governance, it's about community, it's about, I actually wrote this down somewhere, but now I've lost it. But you know what? There is a difference, right? And our focus is different. And I think we just have to recognize that and allow people who want to have that affinity with the United States, allow them to have those conversations. Because if we start to suppress them, then what we're doing is the opposite of what we want to do with everybody, which is include them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, speaking about what we have that's different, we are very different. We have an entirely different education system, an entirely different political system. We have speaking of the treaties, the Indian Act, and some of the discussions that I've had is the role of First Nations, and I'll come to that. I'll bring you back to that, First Nations and Métis folks in all of this. So I'm going to move to the next question that I've got here for you, Stryker, that I'd like to pose to you. How have EDI, and you've touched on this somewhat, but I'll let you emphasize more. How have EDI initiatives positively impacted communities and organizations, particularly in terms of social and economic outcomes?
Well, I think there's a lot of research out there that talks about the benefits of a diverse workforce, of a diverse community, right? When you have multiple perspectives focused on an issue or a concern or improving something, right? You have all that perspective. What happens is you create a deeper understanding of the issue, which then allows the solutions that emerge from that to be stronger, more innovative, and more importantly, they're more inclusive, right? Because they include everybody in the process. So you're less likely to create systemic barriers which limit or exclude people from the process. I think the work that we do in EDI is really about just bringing in that deeper wisdom that we want to have in our institutions that really help us make us strong institutions. But with beyond the productivity of it all, when you have a community, whether it's an organization, a university, or a city, or a corporation, what happens when you bring all that diversity together is you increase people's sense of satisfaction, you increase their sense of security, you increase their ability to feel like they're part of something where they can be appreciated and valued. So at an individual level, what you're really doing is you're making people feel secure, whole, and you're giving them a sense of belonging in their work environment. And we spend 40 plus hours a week in our work environment, sometimes more time than we spend with our families. So that sense of belonging isn't an incidental thing. I think it's a part of how we can be better off as human beings and that sense of wellness so that you can deal with stressors, so you can deal with complexity a little bit better, right? When you feel stronger, when you have that sense of well-being, you can manage things a little bit more effectively. And we're in a society that's constantly going through change now. Right. So there's stressors all over the place, whether it's technology, we've got political issues, we've got all kinds of stresses in our lives. We have concerns for our children, we have concerns for the future, right? And so having a place that gives you that sense of security is a safety blanket for dealing with all that chronic stress. And we do not want chronic stress because that changes our brains. It changes who we are as individuals, which can have lasting effects. So why wouldn't we want to focus on creating a safer space for everybody? I think that's really a part of EDI. And when you do that, you create retention issues. You reduce retention issues, right? You increase the sense that this is a place I want to stay at. Maybe I don't necessarily make more money, a few percentage points more somewhere else, because I have a safe place to be. right? And it's hard to find, right? So when you do get into an organization or even just a team, you can be in a bad organization, but have a great team and feel like you're invincible, like you can do anything and be anywhere, right? And then as soon as that safety is gone, you start to see people start to think, what are my options? Where can I go and what can I go? Which is great for people who have options. But there are so many people who work for organizations that don't necessarily have options. So as leaders, I think it's our responsibility to really create a safe, healthy work environment for everyone, right? Especially those people who may not have as many options who are, or work for a city like the city of Saskatoon and have a great union and who has given them seniority and given them job security so that they can provide for their families and their futures. Why wouldn't we want to provide for their mental health and well-being? It's just about retention, it's about well-being, and it's who we are as Canadians. We do, like I said, travel the 10 kilometers to help somebody change a tire in the middle of wintertime. So I think that this is what it's
Absolutely.
all about.
You talked about a little bit about or mentioned bad organizations and good teams, but there's also, it made me think about great organizations and bad teams. Right?
Yeah, the reverse, yeah. It's
Yes,
true, right?
and how that is a challenge as well within colleagues and peers, etc. And again, we think about our responsibilities and our place within those spaces, those teams. We talked about it a little bit here, just with even the land acknowledgement, right? What
Yeah,
is our place and space and our purpose of existence within the
yeah,
the space we occupy? And the
yeah,
same could be said in the workplace, right? Or out there just in our social lives, right?
yeah, exactly. And we do learn a lot as an organization that might focus on those values. We provide safe spaces for people to learn about their colleagues, learn about differences. And if we can do that, then what do? Is they're going to take that back to their personal lives. So we're not inconsequential in the work we do. If we, as an organization, spend the time to help support a healthy, well-balanced, diverse workforce, then what we're really doing isn't just helping our organization, we're helping the homes and communities, the people who work for us to go back, share that information, maybe provide a different perspective, which may allow other people to grow and to experience a positive space.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that with some of the universities as well that are out there. And I'm not talking about anyone in particular, but some of them that are out there that are undertaking EDI initiatives or indigenization initiatives, for example. And some will look at those as two separate places and spaces and pieces of work that need to be done to separate them apart from each other. But we see some universities that are undertaking at various levels certain degrees of EDI initiatives, and others not so much. But again, some of that comes back to what we we're talking about as that regional. And likely we see those social and economic outcomes changed as a result of those EDI initiatives and how those have impacted various communities and organizations within them, because universities are part of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I remember I did my PhD degree in Ontario. I won't say which university, but so I did my PhD in Ontario, and it was for me, it was a bit of a shock, right? I've lived in Vancouver for 10 years, but Ontario is a very diverse community, right? And so the perspectives and attitudes are very different than what I had experienced here in Saskatchewan. And then I had the reverse, right? Whereas Saskatchewan, we have this really strong, healthy Indigenous culture, and there's a vibrancy and beauty in our communities here, but it's harder to find in Ontario because where there are a smaller percentage of the population. So I did find my community there, and it is also thriving in Ontario, but it's thriving with other communities, right? And there's a beauty in watching all of these diverse communities live together and work together in some ways, right? The sharing of knowledges and ideas, supporting each other. When you have that healthy community, it's a beautiful place to watch your children grow up. And I think we have that here in Saskatchewan. I think Saskatchewan's one of those places that we can do better. I'll honestly admit there's room for improvement. But in the last 20 or 30 years, I've seen a huge difference in our community. And as it becomes more socially conscious and aware of our diversity, how much more we're giving back to each other and supporting each other. It's coming in fits and starts, but it is improving. If you look, anybody who talk about it, there's been a big improvement over the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So that moves me to the next question I'd like to ask you is, which really has to do with challenges faced by EDI programs. What are some of the common challenges that you think that are out there for EDI programs, and what are some of those solutions, innovative solutions that might have been implemented to overcome these challenges or could be implemented to
Yeah.
overcome?
Well, as I said earlier, right, one of the biggest challenges I think in the work that's been done in the past is that there was certain community people that felt like they were excluded or it wasn't about them. And I think that's a big problem because it's a miscommunication because EDI is about everybody, right? If you really want to break down diversity, right, beyond the typical age human rights components, right? We all have different skills and abilities. We all have different lived experiences and things that we bring to the conversation. We have different hobbies, right? And we do. So diversity lives everywhere we go, right? So what the work that I think is really important in the EDI work and the challenge that needs to be overcome is to find that common ground that works for everybody, right? Includes everybody, right? And even that means people have dissenting views, right? What you want to do is allow them to have dissenting views, but we want to do so in a respectful and kind way. And so I think that's a big part of what we need to do. I think another thing that's important is that we want to look at the political and social climate, right? It does have an effect. What's concerning for me in the United States is that the anti-EDI movement has sort of been used as a tool or a mechanism for votes and political power. There's a strong correlation between certain states where conservative politicians have sort of bandied up the anti-EDI movement, and it's gained them a lot of votes and a lot of support, which gives them a lot more leeway, gives them a little bit more certainty for the next election. And so they're doubling down. And I think that's what we're seeing with Trump and his efforts to sort of dismantle all of the EDI work and all that things that the United States has been working towards for, as I said earlier, centuries, right? I think that work is challenging, and I don't want to see that happen here in Canada. I really want us to go back to our basic values and belief, right? That a community of people is stronger and better off together than they are in a broken up piece where we're fighting with each other. And I think with social media and our digital world that we live in, there's a real risk of us losing that connectivity, that sense of it. So I think that social and the political climate does have an impact on here. I also think that the challenge here is that there is a resistance to change. And that's not just change around the EDI, that's just change overall, right? Life keeps evolving and accelerating with technology and with the changes in the world around us and with environmental concerns. We're dealing with change on a constant basis. And that is a lot of work, right? And so when you're looking for things that you don't have control on, sometimes grabbing onto something that you feel like you can control, and in this sense, taking on maybe the anti-EDI perspective and fighting for rights for yourself can feel like it's a nurturing thing for you. But I think what's really important here is that we have to recognize that change takes a little bit of effort, and we have to be compassionate with people because some people have a high tolerance for uncertainty and some people have a low tolerance for uncertainty. And when you have a low tolerance for uncertainty, you need structure, you need consistency. And so when we're asking people to look at the social structure, the political structure, the cultural structure of our society, and we're asking them to shift it, that is a huge challenge for some people, right? And when we have that happening, we have to be compassionate. We have to recognize that it's going to take time and we want to do so and find a good way to do it. So I think that's another challenge, right? And then I think there's a constant conversation about meritocracy when it comes to EDI, and that the EDI right now, it takes away from meritocracy as if we are giving people an advantage without them having earned it. And I don't think that's true. I do not believe that's true, but that's a narrative that people are using. And I think that's created this anti-reverse racism movement, right? And this is why we see the repealing of the affirmative action when it comes to universities in the United States. But meritocracy in a moment is different than meritocracy over a lifetime. And as somebody who comes from a community of people who have struggled to have opportunity to earn the skills and abilities to have be equal with other people, there is no meritocracy sometimes in some places and spaces because we haven't been given the same opportunities. And so I think there's a difference between meritocracy in the moment when you're evaluating two people equally in a space and place and time, but there's a different when you're looking at it over time. And I think there's a conversation to be had there, but we have to do so because there's challenges for people from socially disadvantaged or socioeconomically disadvantaged communities as well, right? This isn't just based on race or religion or sexual orientation or identity. It comes in all different ways and shapes and sizes. So we want to look at that more holistically and generally. And then for me, I think what happens when you have shifts and changes in political environments or the social cultural environments, what happens when you have a challenging economic society where we're going about to potentially go into a recession due to all the challenges that are coming out from the South and everything like that, we're going to see companies trying to decide what are their priorities and where are we going to invest our money in our organizations. And that is a difficult conversation because it comes down to life and liberty and all the things that organizations like to have, but may not necessarily be able to afford to have. And those decisions are difficult. Governments have to make those decisions as well. And we're going to have to see a lot of challenges coming from that way. And this is, again, going back to what I was saying before. If we're focused on commonalities and supporting each other, we recognize the value of mental health. We might have to make a business case for it, all right? Recognizing that when you don't have to replace your staff because turnover is low, because people feel safe, they have a sense of belonging, they feel supported, that's an economic benefit. There's all kinds of economic benefits that come from EDI. And unfortunately, I don't want to boil it down to a dollar sign, but when you have a downturn in an economy, sometimes that is an important thing to distinguish. Not the only thing, but an important thing that must be part of the decision-making process.
It's huge because, as you know, as we all know, when we see funding having to be cut or budgets having to be cut, we're very aware that First Nations, Métis folks, Inuit folks are often some of the first line items that are looked at. And I can speak to that from my own experience, having worked in a First Nations organization and seeing that happen as changes occur in government, right? We will see some of that. So really, very good pieces coming through in that question. So thank you for that response. It's, again, looking at those solutions, right? They're so broad and so many different parts of the picture that we need to take into account. And region is a huge one. And organization. What are we talking? Are we talking about a university setting? Are we talking about a government office, etc.?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that moves me then to, and we've got quite a number of questions coming in from the audience, which I will get to. And some of them, as I look at them, I'm seeing you're answering them as you're speaking. So audience members, if I jump over your question, that's simply because I felt it came through in a response from Stryker. So in the case of not having him to repeat too much, which I'm sure he will as it is.
Yeah.
All right, because I'm going to force him to with some of the questions, obviously. So when we think about how can corporations effectively support EDI initiatives and ensure their long-term sustainability, the long-term longevity of EDI initiatives, even in the face of political and social pressures that we just talked about?
Well, this is a difficult conversation. I think we see in the States, we're seeing all kinds of organizations caving to political pressure, and for good reasons, albeit if you have a White House or a federal government who is pushing you to remove or dismantle EDI efforts, and you rely on those federal government or that government level government for some type of grants, for future bidding opportunities, for contracts and so forth, how they want you to frame things and how they want to do things is about your economic well-being. I think that's a bit of a challenge. I think that's when you have a government that is that one-sided in their approach to governance, it can create a bit of a challenge because you'll have other organizations like Apple. I think is recently they fought back and they're saying that they're going to maintain their EDI. I think Coca-Cola is another one. There's a number of organizations that have come public saying that EDI isn't just a choice; it's part of their culture. And Costco, there you go, somebody helping out here. So I think what's really important here is that we want to recognize that when we're talking about our workforce, we're not talking about a commodity. We're talking about people. And people are something that we have to take very seriously and we have to treat with respect and kindness because people choose to work for our corporations and they choose to spend their life force supporting some type of initiative, and there's supposed to be a reciprocity there. We're supposed to support them, they're supposed to support us. And I understand that we may sometimes have layoffs and so forth, but there's supposed to be some general agreements there. And so EDI for corporations, it just really needs to refocus it. I know that the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter really kicked up the idea of EDI for a period of time there for almost 2.5 years. There was a real strong presence in the corporate world around EDI. But what's really important is that they may not necessarily have come at it with the right approach. And that would be my opinion. I think when you are using EDI as a tool for promotion, self-promotion, reputation building, and so forth, if you don't come at it with the right principles, the right values, you don't recognize the true value of what it is you're doing. If you are just engaging in it to show the public that you're part of the in moment, right? I think what you're doing is also creating harm, right? Because you're taking away from EDI, you're taking away from the emphasis, which is on the quality of life and making sure that people have a sense of belonging in the communities and the corporations they work for. And so I think what's really important here is that we want to move forward in the right tone and with the right purpose and with the right intent. And I think corporations need to sort of do that deep dive because if they think about it, their employees are the reason why they're successful. And when those employees feel safe and secure, when they can have positive conflict, and by positive conflict, I mean have a really constructive conversation about an idea, a product, an innovation, really they can create a better environment with more opportunities for wealth, right, for the corporation. And I think they've done a lot of research that shows that corporations that have a lot of diversity with different perspectives financially outproduce other corporations. They actually stay away from polarized thinking. They make fewer mistakes. They do better overall. The economic health of a corporation is stronger. And I think Apple stands by that in a very strong way as one of the most innovative companies in a global sense. So I think corporations just need to invest in the right way. They have to understand what the true benefit of EDI is, and then they have to make it part of their core values. It can't be a surface thing. It can't be a distant thing. It has to be right built into their DNA. And when you build that in and you start to cherish and recognize all of this, the benefits just continue to, it's almost like an exponential curve, the benefits that come with that kind of engagement.
No, thank you for that. And I think what you talked about, the facade, this idea of, just to show or demonstrate, or I was kind of making some notes and I used the term show off, right?
Yeah.
That corporations want to show off or say, yeah, here's what we're doing. But where is again back to the proofs in the pudding? Where is it? Where do
Yeah.
we see it visible? Where is it happening? And it's interesting conversation because we think about EDI and we think it's impacting folks that come within that categorization. But it's interesting to think about do your own soul searching and say, how am I affected when I'm in a space and I'm hearing, and it happened to me not long ago, and somebody was speaking, and using language that they thought visibly didn't, I was not of that group, of that cultural background. And so it would be safe to be able to use that kind of language in my presence.
Yeah.
And when I talk to students, I tell them, it's really important that you're respected as a human being. So I look at that person and I say, what makes you think it's okay to talk like that? Why do you think I'm going to be in agreement with your what's coming out of your mouth right now? right?
Yeah,
The language that's being used. So when we think about EDI, and you talked about safe spaces and places where corporations need to support EDI, they're not just supporting EDI initiatives for EDI folk. And
yeah,
that's a huge message. They're
yeah.
doing it for all of us, right?
For all of their clients and all of their employees. That's a huge, that's 100% of everybody that they interact with.
Absolutely.
Yes, right.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And the same can be when we talk about gender, when we think we see what we believe are males in a setting or in a room, to female bash, for example. Why do we think that would be okay? Because it's all just guys anyway, and they're all going to, be in
no,
agreement
yeah,
and
yeah.
not
I agree.
not away,
Well,
right?
and can I introduce another idea just in this moment? Because I think we're in a social media world now, right? Where we have these instant mem moments where you have small clips of reality. Info is in having a sort of having a big social impact. And I think with the algorithms driving people and using their emotional engagement with the pieces, right? And I think as human beings, that fear response really creates that sort of emotional engagement. And I think those algorithms bank on that. And I think that what's happening here is we're creating a fear-based society almost, right? Where we're afraid of everything. We're afraid of our neighbors. We're afraid of people we've known forever because they suddenly have an opinion or an idea that's different than our own. And then we get all this reinforcement that our fear is legitimate and it builds an identity. And I think corporations aren't innocent. They're not they're impacted by that as well. And I think a lot of corporations, especially with the Black Lives Movement, got on board on the social media level, thinking this is all we have to do or this is what we need to do. But what they did is they lost the opportunity to really support everybody that makes them who they are and makes them successful. And I think that work is really sort of something we have to recognize, that with a social media background now as a big influence in our lives, that we're a big challenge coming ahead, right? Until we can figure out how to manage that, come to terms with it, mature with it. I don't know what the goal is or how we're going to do it, but it has to be on our minds.
Absolutely. And you talked about fear earlier. And again, when you talked about that, just makes me think about, you talked about uncertainty, right?
Okay.
So when we think about uncertainty and we think about regional spaces, and even some of the questions are talking about different regional areas, whether it's, another province or a particular university. But that uncertainty and how it sits and how it exists within those various places, spaces, whether it be a government office, whether it be in a university setting, uncertainty often, not always, but often, most often, leads us to fear. And I encourage us to think about the pandemic here, right?
Oh
When
yeah.
we
Yep.
didn't know what was going on, we didn't, or so, many folks were claiming we knew nothing about vaccines or et cetera, right? On and on and on. All this uncertainty. You talked about social media, a lot of that came through. So that social media outlets that created that fear, right? And
Yeah.
when we think about EDI, you can very much apply this. And and in turn turns to bias. We create these biases in our minds, right? Or what we think we're seeing, if whether it be favoritism for another staff member because they are part of an EDI process or EDI programs, et cetera. So biases, and then bringing that even further into prejudices, Stryker. And
Yeah.
then when we're talking about race, for example, it would also then extend to racism, right? Eventually. And so when we think about how those things come back to us as a community, as people, we see that the very underpinnings and beginnings of some of these can lead to some really dangerous places and spaces. And that's just
Yeah.
in relation to, for example, when we talk racism in that sense. But when we talk uncertainty, to fear, to bias, to prejudice, and it's the way we act out in our beliefs, right? So misinformation.
So now you've just cued me to the really was something that's very important to me, something that I advocate for, is that we can no longer, and this is I'm going back to my farming roots, we can no longer be cows on a highway, right?
Yeah,
We really have to recognize that we're blocking opportunities for us to move forward as a society when we mill about and we prevent other people from doing it. We don't have to agree. We don't even have to know exactly what's happening or why we're going, but I think it's best to get on to one side of the issue or the road and go, or the other side, wait, learn, figure it out. And if you're somebody who has a low tolerance for uncertainty, right, which then impedes fear or creates fear, you might have to say, okay, I'm going to sit back and wait and figure things out, right? And if nobody's harassing you or making you feel bad about it, and you feel like there's a sense of safety and security because people are supporting you and giving you the grace to be able to come to terms with what it is you're trying to figure out and how to manage it and what it means to you. I think we give people the opportunity to feel like, oh, this is going to be okay, which is a psychologically buoyant thing, which increases their resilience, lowers their stress, and more importantly, helps them feel optimistic. And optimism is the best counter to fear. And I think as a society, we need to do that. But I think we oftentimes take a neutral stance. We feel like we can't interfere in other people. And I do agree we shouldn't interfere in other people, but we should take a positive engagement with our communities. And I think that that's an important thing. And I think we've seen a bit of that lost through the digital spaces, through the conflicts that we're seeing, through the fear and uncertainty as you described it. And I think as both as organizations, as corporations, we don't have to get on either side of an issue, but what we can do is invest in the people that matter to us, which is again our employees and our clients. And we want to make sure that they have their well-being as it's important to us, show that to them, explain it to them, and help them understand that we're in this together. And I think that kind of engagement really creates a nurturing space in place where we can have some really difficult conversations, those productive conflicts, and we will resolve them and we will come to a better place that will feed our children and give them a better opportunity down the road.
yeah, absolutely. And that's what really, when we look at it, it's having a better life for doing better than our parents, doing better than our grandparents did, right? And
Right.
essentially, when we think about what we do when we're in the academy, that's for the most part what we're striving to do
Yeah.
is
The
to
universal truth. It's something we can all share together, right? Because we all care about the well-being of our children.
absolutely. And whether we have children or not, but those next generations coming through. And I'm sure a lot of us are thinking that right now is what's there going to be there for my children, my grandchildren, right? And again,
Yeah.
especially with the whole idea around the nationalist views of things.
And I appreciate you mentioned that we don't all have children, right? But
Yeah,
we have family and we have people we care about, right? So this is really about everybody's well-being.
absolutely. And we are leaving something when we go, right?
Yeah.
Those legacies that we leave behind. So with the US now, I want to move, and now you did speak a little bit about United States. So with the United States taking a very active and anti-EDI perspective, we know that. And we see it actually coming, we see some of it coming here. We talked a little bit about that. We see some of it coming into universities as well. So when we see that anti-EDI perspective at the federal level and beyond, what do you feel will happen here in Canada? And I know you're speculating, and I know we have to also be cognizant of our own roles, right? So I
Yeah.
do totally appreciate that. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that one, Stryker?
Well, I hate the idea that the United States has decided to pick on us with tariffs, is trying to sort of turn us from friend to foe. I think it's some type of power move. I don't actually understand the political ambition there, but I'll leave it to better people than myself to think about that. But what I think it's really done is it's reminded us that we are Canadians, right? And an attack on Canada is an attack on all of us, right? And with this, whatever power move is happening, I think it's really helped us realize that we're in this together, right? Whether you're Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, whichever region you come from, we're all going to be impacted in some way or another. And I think what's happened there is it's sort of reminded us who we are. And I chuckled the other day because I saw a video. Do you remember the old days when they had the Canadian beer? I am Canadian, I am Joe. Well, now they've got one that's I am Jeff, and it's a spin-off of what's happening in Canada. And I got proud. I got a little, maybe even a bit teary-eyed at the sense that we would come together to support each other in a difficult times, right? Because that's what I want for my community. That's what I want for my family. It's what I want for the organization I work with. I want to feel like when things get difficult, I can rely on others and others can rely on me to be a part of it. And in doing so, I think as we focus on and creating that nurturing space where we can all be ourselves, right? Where we can bring our best selves and make the place that we live in, whether it's work or at home, a better place. I think that EDI is going to thrive. I think Canada has a different set of values and beliefs than Americans. We share some values, but whether we prioritize this one over another makes a huge difference, right? And as Canadians, we're traditional in the sense that we know where we come from, we care about where we are, and we know that this is where we live, right? And while we might want some of the benefits that the United States has, I think a majority of people still want to call Canada home, and they want to invest in that. And I think if we can find a nice, meaningful way to create a rebrand of EDI, if we can find a way to help build that common ground for all of us to sort of feel included and to recognize that we support each other for our future well-being, I think with EDI, in whatever form that looks like, will thrive. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to show, as we've done many times, because I think some of the narratives I hear of the United States is I wish we were a little bit more like Canada these days, right? And I think we should double down on that belief, not only for them, because we want to be role models, but I think what we really need to do is show our children, right? And this is the same as what happened in World War I and World War II. Our parents had to go out and show us and teach us what we stood for and how much we were going to work for it to be true. And I think this is our challenge now, and I think we can do it.
Absolutely. And when we think about, what's happening in the United States and what's going on, we've heard more than once President Trump talking about there's two genders, right? For example,
Yeah.
male and female. And again, thinking about how that has set us back so many decades, generations, really. And it's interesting when we think about gender in Indigenous societies and the
Exactly.
pre-contact roles that were there and that existed. And it brings me to this past weekend in Saskatoon, your hometown, where there was a two-spirit powwow. So
Yeah.
we see a lot of that happening now in our communities, in Indigenous communities, where we are actually embracing the ways in which we were such advanced societies. And it's ironic that we were called all kinds of names, whether it be uncivilized or savage or whatever racist language that was used to describe us, and misinformed and misrepresent us as Indigenous folks. And to think about how truly advanced we were and what we could have taught the rest of the world had we been given that opportunity, right?
Yeah.
It's not that we didn't try. Certainly, we know the results of colonization and particularly missionaries, the churches, and government, and some of government policy as well. Church policy that impacted how we view gender and how we view the concepts and ideas around who we are, whether it's gender and sexuality, whether it's gender identification, whether it's gender status, whether it's gender variance. But to think about how advanced we were as societies having those notions. In First Nation societies pre-contact, we know that there was more than two genders. We know that.
Yeah.
And we've accepted that now. We know that for the most part there was four, and in some nations there was as many as 8, and some there was as many as 16. But we know that that's not all. We know we're still learning about that.
Yeah.
And so how advanced those societies were in reality when we really look at that. But it comes back to that uncertainty, that fear, that bias, that prejudice, that misinformation, right? And so when I think about EDI, I think about Indigenous pre-contact folks, and I think about Indigenous folks, the Métis folks as they came, and I think about how we were so much more than what we are today in that way of thinking, and how taking us back to male, female, or man, woman is pulling us back into that darkness again, right? Where we are just starting to come past the impacts of colonization and impacts of the church residential school, and starting to reconcile not just with descendants of newcomers, but with ourselves and the loss of so much of those knowledge systems that we did have to force to suppress, right?
Yeah.
And now to see that coming back forward and to listen to the responses of particularly Indigenous people saying, heck no, it's not happening. We're not stepping back again for the
Yeah.
colonizer.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting when we have those conversations, and so many folks are really unaware of where those conversations need to go and have gone and can go and are going, right?
Yeah.
And that's why within community, it's so step into a First Nations community and that conversation is going to be very different today.
Yeah.
On EDI. So when I think about EDI and I think about our traditional perspectives of EDI, we think about breaking down that language of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the whole idea of diversity was so embraced when we think about gender.
Yeah.
Within Indigenous communities pre-contact. And so I say for myself, understanding and knowing what I know now, having become more educated and listening to our knowledge on this, and that knowledge is re-emerging, whether it's through our knowledge keepers, our elders, or through spiritual practices, through ceremony, right, through dreams, etc. That re-engaging and re-embracing of those understandings of who we are. So equity, diversity, and inclusion is something that we always had and that we always espoused and we always practiced.
Yeah.
And so to step back from that, personally, I don't see Indigenous people accepting that or allowing that or moving. And even this idea of EDI in itself sometimes can be more difficult for us to actually embrace and understand because it's just who we are. It was just our natural way of interacting and being with people. I remember asking my mushum, my grandfather, and grandmothers as well, about the black robes, they called them, about the
Yeah.
missionaries. And when I first went into my undergraduate program in 1989, really being at odds with myself as a student, as an undergrad student, and saying, how is it? And learning about, all the different pieces that I hadn't learned about, in whether it was through family or through oral history or through the stories, but hearing about different pieces, Columbus, et cetera, and wondering, how was it that we didn't just go and take down the black robes? They couldn't have been that hard to take down if we would have wanted to. And I had to ask that question. And so the young me was really questioned, why didn't we just remove them, whether forcibly or physically or violently,
Yeah.
out of our communities? It wouldn't have been very difficult to do. And I was told because we wanted to hear them. Everybody had a voice, and what they had to say and teach and preach was of interest. It wasn't that we were going to take that on and say, oh, yes, we must become Christians because our ways are so horrible. That wasn't it at all. It was a matter of saying, we have our space, we have our ways and our understandings. Nobody's taking that from us or imposing anything on us, not yet anyway, at the beginning. But it's interesting to watch those individuals and hear what they have to say and respect them for what they have to say. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, really. Sorry, Stryker, I didn't mean to take so much of the
No,
time.
no, it's beautiful. And I just say those black robes were storytellers, and we love a good story. But I'm just gonna touch on that a little bit because I know there's some questions coming out of the audience. But I'll be honest. A lot of what I believe about EDI and the future of Canadian society, I'm very much impacted by my Indigenous, my Métis family, and from the elders who have taught me. And I do, right, living in relationship with other people, that whole sense of community, right, and that's where I think Indigenous people really excel. That is, if you contributed to community, you were valued and appreciated and respected. respected, right? And that didn't matter how you did it, whether you not you had mental health challenges, whether you had different identities or gender or whatever that was, as long as you were a contributor to community, you were appreciated, valued, and respected, right? And that goes further than just the individuals, right? Like we're talking about we're talking about two-legged, four-legged, the animals, the plants, and everything. So anything that contributed to community was respected and appreciated, right? And that is the true balance of engagement with diversity, right? And as you're describing it, it was just who we were. We didn't have to question it. We didn't have to talk about it. It just is. And so I agree that that's one of the beautiful things about Canada. And I think one of the things that's going to help the movement in EDI is that reconciliation is bringing back those ideas and bringing them out and broadening them and teaching them to other people. And I think that that will lend itself to the movement that we have here in Canada in creating a strong society.
And that's a beautiful thing, because when we think about even, the coming of the Europeans onto our shores, right? And those same questions have been asked by many, young First Nations minds, young Métis minds, is, how did that happen? How did we allow them onto our lands to begin with, right from the onset? And it speaks to that idea of what I just talked about with black robes and how you've accentuated that and brought that forward. And when we think about our roles in reconciliation and our place amongst one another, that coexistence, it's so important. And
Well, the
it,
relationship, yeah.
absolutely coming
Yeah.
together and living amongst each other, with each other, beside each other. And
Yeah.
that when we entered into treaty, that was the intention, was that we would bring the non-Indigenous folk amongst us, allow them amongst us, but they would also be learning about who we are, our culture, and understanding that. And it was the belief that our ways of understanding other folks was just something that was human. That's the way people were,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And to soon learn that that was not the case, because it certainly was during the fur trade.
Well, yeah,
And
there was a
then,
period of small time slot where there was Métis
yes.
community. The Métis community emerged out of that belief system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was different things being sought after. It was furs, not land, right? Or resources. And
Yeah.
when we look at the resources today, we're having a lot of discussion around that. So, thinking about First Nations, Métis mindset within that is really important. So I'm going to bring you to another question, one of the last questions, then we'll move into some of the audience questions, because we've got a couple here that I'd like to pose to you. Some of them you've already responded to. What are the potential future directions for EDI initiatives, and how can we ensure that they continue to evolve and address the needs of diverse communities?
Well, for me, I'm a big believer in two things, and this is where I think I'm moving in my mind, and hopefully in the work that I do, is I really want to start promoting social cohesion, right? I really want, like, again, I talked about this, and so I don't have to go into detail, but I really want to focus on creating an inclusive, supported, and connected community. I want people to be able to come together and feel like they can have a good conversation, get to know each other, learn from each other, and they don't necessarily have to be best friends, but there's a mutual respect and understanding that together we can know each other well enough that we can get along and we can create a better space and place for our children and for our family and everybody like that. So it's really based on values, mutual respect, and creating that collective well-being, recognizing we are a community, right? And safe, strong communities create opportunities for people, both in a personal level, but also in a professional level, at a corporate level, at a government level, right? When you have a strong community that gets along and moves together and supports each other, has difficult conversations, I think you create a better, more productive well-being for everybody and create opportunities. So for me, I think social cohesion is really a big part, and it's imbued with all the EDI principles, right? Everything that we've talked about today is part of a socially cohesive community or society. And so I think that's really important. The other thing that I think is really important is that we have to recognize that there are barriers out there, that the barriers are built into our institutions, they're built into our society, they're built into our attitudes, they're built into all these things, and they interlock to create systemic systemic barriers that are complex. And you need to be able to undo those in a very careful way, right? Because we know using a blunt tool, like maybe what was happening in the States previous to now, I think a bit of too blunt, right? And there was causing harm, it created uncertainty, and it created people to feel like they had to withdraw or felt like they were excluded, which then had to force themselves to figure out a new way of being well, creating that sense of well-being. So I think when we start to undo those structural barriers, those systemic barriers, we need to do so carefully, we need to do so thoughtfully, and we need to do so with intention and commitment. But it has to be done in a good way. And again, the good way is the Indigenous way is for me, but for me, the good way is really about we're caring about the people around you and recognizing all those relationships and making sure that you honor those relationships while you remove those barriers. And I think those two things for me are really a big part of how we move forward in a good way. I think it's for me how I see it myself rebranding EDI and making sure that everybody is part of this process and that everybody finds their truth for what they want to do and how they want to live their lives in Canada.
No, excellent. Absolutely. Some of this, when we talk, we've had lot of discussion here this afternoon just around various pieces, various areas. But when we talk about right in the room, right at the ground level, I'm going to turn now to one of the questions from our audience members. And the question is, when EDI conflicts arise at the ground level, so right in that space, how can we create an inclusive environment that respects differing views? What practical steps can workers take to address tension and foster peace? Really good question.
Yeah. So I think if first and foremost, you have to start with the idea that this is that we have to hear from everybody, right? And that we want to engage in meaningful conversation, not in a way that causes harm, right? Because some people come to conversations not to listen, but to be heard and to tell or to create tension, right? And I think there's a difference between having a good conversation than being yelled at or told how to be and what to do, right? So you have to create a listening environment. And then you have to take your time. Again, there are certain people that have a high tolerance for uncertainty and the people have a low tolerance for uncertainty. So if you're going to build trust, right? Because trust is a really big part of whether or not you're going to have a negative conflict or whether you're going to have a positive conflict. And conflict is an inevitable thing of human nature. I think we all have conflict, but you can guide it towards a positive conflict if you have trust. And trust isn't something I think you give out to everybody. I think it's some people earn it, some people navigate it, some people have to have a moment where it catalyzes. Trust comes in different ways, but if you focus on trust, then you can go to the point where you can have good conflict, which means that you still have trust, which also means that you have safety, which then you start to benefit because good conflict leads to stronger commitments, better understanding, which then increases results, and then also ultimately for corporations and organizations, productivity, right? And I think that's a big part of it. So how do you create that trusting environment? Well, first you have to not do what everybody expects, which is hold people, police them for not speaking the right way or doing things the right way, right? And then holding that space in place for people to have a long enough moments so that they come to terms of understanding a little bit. You also need to look for commonalities, things that bridge people's differences, right? And I've worked with groups of employees who have long-standing issues that are years and years old, right? But if I can create a structured space in place where they can have maybe not with each other, but a group conversation, suddenly they learn something about the person that they didn't know. And suddenly there's a different perspective and it's a crack or a chink in the armor, which allows for that conversation or that relationship to emerge differently. So I think creating that listening space, creating trust, and sometimes creating structured opportunities for people to learn about each other is really a starting point for building something that can become a meaningful change for a work environment.
No, I love that. That's, when we think about that, because we all just want to be respected, right? We want our voices to be respected. And sometimes I feel that if folks aren't feeling that they're being heard or they're being respected or they're being, pushed away and not understood, then that does create it's a comeback attitude, right?
Yeah.
And in any crucial conversation, for folks who know how to handle those crucial conversations, that's one of the first things that you think about is what are our main goals? What do you want and what do I want? And really hearing that person. So
Yeah.
it brings me back to this question here that we've got, and it comes it really comes back to what you were talking about. How do we address this false notion that EDI is about diluting meritocracy?
I think I talked about this earlier, right? I think it comes down to misunderstanding. I think again, if you want to be a non-believer, if you want to set yourself up, you're gonna anchor yourself to something that seems like the ultimate tool for just knocking down the other person's argument. But if you're doing that, then you're no longer in a conversation. You're really talking at people, right? Telling them what you think and believe, right? Meritocracy is a complex thing, right? The belief that we're all equal and that we all earn the right isn't true. I went to school, I had a learning disorder, and I should have had the same opportunities to grow. But people didn't treat me well because they didn't understand me, and I lost all the opportunities. I had to go back in my mid-20s and do my GED. People assume that because I have a PhD that I must have lived a privileged life, but that is so far from the truth, right? I had to go further to earn the right, and I had to prove to people above and beyond everything that I was capable of learning and that I was capable of being a student. And so I think what we're talking about here is that meritocracy is a thing, but it's an ideal more than it is a truth. And I said this earlier, you can work towards meritocracy in a moment where you treat people who have applied for a job, who are applying for promotion, who are presenting two ideas. There can be meritocracy in a moment, but I think over a lifetime, it's a lot harder to do, right? Because if you're not given the opportunities due to the systemic barriers that exist, due to historical oppression that still lingers in certain ways, or people who have misunderstandings because they separate themselves from other communities because of fear, then they don't understand and appreciate what's being said. And I think then what happens is meritocracy is a lot harder thing to achieve. So as an ideal, I believe it's important, but does it exist in true form in every moment? I think that is a hard thing to believe.
Oh, it's such a really good points there. And that brings me to, the idea of, I'll use First Nations women in the academy.
100%.
Trying to move through the academy, whether it be professorships or tenureships, et cetera, et cetera. There's been a lot done out there and a lot said out there in that area. And First Nations women, Métis women will tell you that they had to work harder. And I can speak to that as a academic,
Yeah.
that the expectations are quite a bit different.
Yeah, and
So
lots of people have to work harder, and that's not to say that they won't, and it's not that they say that they can't do it.
yeah,
It just means the starting line wasn't equal for everyone.
absolutely. So no, really good point. So I've got another question here, you've talked a little bit about this. How can organizations and communities have safe, and I know it might be taking you back to the question just before the diluting meritocracy, but how can organizations and communities have safe DEI conversations or EDI conversations and find the vehicle to soften the force of uncertainty? Who are the respected voices to lead these conversations? We talked about having those conversations, but whose job is that? Who's in charge? Who should be in charge of that?
Well, first and foremost, I think those opportunities are hard. They don't come easily always, right? When they do come organically, that's the most beautiful thing when everybody comes together for the right purpose and the right intention. But I think what happens is I think the starting point, again, because you have to build trust to create opportunity, the starting point is to find common ground. I often speak about our children, right? For me, it's hard to convince somebody, individual who's already got an idea, a belief about certain things, right? And it's not necessarily even an easy conversation. But if I talk about the future well-being of my child and my children, and I ask them if they have the same commonality, expectations and hopes and dreams, I can find common ground. And then we can start talking about, well, what do we need to do to provide them a starting point and giving them opportunities to grow and things. So I think within communities that you have similar things. People want safety, right? They want opportunity. They want to have prosper, right? They want to be able to grow, right? Whether it's economic prosperity and personal well-being, whatever that prosperity looks like, we care about that and we want other people to do it, but we can't necessarily do it on our own. And I think this is really the basis of all cultures, right? Is as individuals going in separate directions, we're less likely to survive because we're all competing with each other. But if we as a community come together and support each other, our survival goes up, right? And so what we want to do is look for those common grounds and really say, okay, what do we want to see? What do we have challenges challenges with, what are the things we want to reinforce and support, and then agree on that and support each other, and then build that safe space around those ideas. Then you just have to make that space a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger, and over time you grow. But it takes a lot of time in the beginning, right? You got to go slow to go fast is my favorite expression these days. And if you take that time to go slow, eventually you get that exponential curve, which then over time you've got trust. And when trust comes in, you have positive conflict, and then again, commitment to a better idea or a movement for programs. And I think that helps with uncertainty around change, right? Because trust gives you a little bit of latitude. You know the people you're working with, you may not know them, or they may come from a different place or with lived different experiences. But if you built up that trust, you'll give them a little bit of leeway, and because you can go a little bit further before the uncertainty starts to overwhelm you. And that little moment over time, that pattern of success and opportunity can really reinforce a supporting, engaged space for everyone.
Yep, absolutely. And again, so some of that comes back to that trust,
Yeah.
right? And when we feel that trust, it opens up so many different conversations that would not exist. And it comes back to this idea that we talked about earlier of, you know, when we think we're in a safe space, or we think we can say things that aren't going to be taken, you know, beyond that, if you will. So creating that trust.
Yeah.
So I've got a specific question here now from regarding universities or university situations, right? Accommodations. So some of the accommodations, because we talked a little bit about neurodiversity, some of the accommodations for neurodiversity, for example, not writing more than one final exam in the same day, access to quiet rooms, etc. So when students apply for accommodations,
Yeah.
they do not seem like they should be accommodations per se. It seems like these should be policy changes for everyone. So another example that this audience member is using is flex time for childcare, which is supposed to benefit women, but benefits all parents regardless of gender. So feeling sometimes like EDE puts these cultural shifts on the backs of minorities, and that seems unfair. Do you agree with that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is a complex conversation right here.
Yeah, it
So
is.
I'm
And
gonna,
that's
I
why I thought I
apologize.
wanted to put that out there, because you talked about neurodiverse, and I wanted to have
Yeah.
some discussion around that because it's really important to me.
Yeah. So I think I may simplify this a little bit. Doesn't mean I don't understand the complexity of what we're talking about. But accessibility barriers is what we're describing here. Those don't exist. They're built. Right. And that's inevitably what happens is as a society, as a university, we want to give many people an opportunity to grow and to learn. And we have to assess them to make sure that they're learning what they know so that they can go out into the world and do a good work with a solid foundation of knowledge. In order to provide the greater number of people that opportunity, we built systems. But in building those systems, we inevitably built barriers into those systems that support certain groups of people or a large number of people, but not everybody. And that's both from a neurodiversity, it's a cultural thing. There's lots of ways in which those barriers are built in. And when you have those barriers built in, but the system does work well in certain ways for certain groups of people, then you do have to create accommodations for the built barriers. The accommodations aren't for the individual, they're for the system that is fundamentally flawed and it doesn't provide the support in a meaningful way or in the right way that understands people come in all these different ways of which they might believe, think, and behave, and so forth. And so those are accommodations that aren't applied to the individual, they're applied to the system. And I think that would be great. It's hard to be able to give everybody an individual plan. There's so many people in this world, there's 300,000 people living in Saskatoon. And while we want to focus on meeting all of their needs, there are going to be times where we recognize the system is built in a way that doesn't necessarily support everybody. So we're going to have to create accommodations for the system to allow individuals to participate, right? And to prevent those barriers from impeding their autonomy, independence, and their goals of whatever it is they want to achieve in life or work. So yeah, I would say that us saying these are accommodations for individuals is a misnomer. It's really accommodation for the system that's not necessarily functionally adequate.
That wasn't set up properly for the
Yeah.
individuals. Really good point. So true. And I see that a lot with students, right? And we do see increased numbers of students having to apply for accommodations
Yeah.
in ways where we should have had those policies in
I
place.
was somebody who benefited from accommodations, and look what I'm doing for my community, right? Like without that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be doing some labor job and feeling very stressed about life.
Yes. Absolutely. And I can agree with that. And when you talked about, going and doing the GED and now the PhD, my story, right?
Yeah,
So and as well benefiting from accommodations, right? And not in any way to try to work a system or anything like that, but in order for me to be able to be successful and to be
yeah,
able
to show your true potential, right?
yeah, I wouldn't be here,
Yeah.
right? I'd
Well,
still be
I'm
working at
glad you're here.
McDonald's, slinging
Thank you.
burgers. Right?
Exactly. Exactly. I probably work in a restaurant, so I could get some free meals.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to just I know we're getting really close to the end here. I'm just going to make a statement from one of the audience members. We'll close
Yep.
with that. She says a simple strategy that I find helps in conversation is to start by affirming the other person. And again, we had some discussion around this. Either their perspective, their good intentions, or something I related to about what they're saying. And
Yeah.
again, coming back to when we're having critical conversations, actually really hearing, right? Then I can address what I disagree with after first having established a bit of solidarity and hopefully from that, safety. So really good perspective there coming through. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to the audience for all your incredible questions here. I wish we could have had time to get through them all. Stryker was just amazing here. But we are
You're
nearing
too
the end of
kind.
our you are sorry. We are nearing the end of our time together. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank today's speaker, Stryker Calvez, Dr. Stryker Calvez, for his insight and observations on how we can overcome new challenges to EDI in order to continue advancing EDI initiatives. Thank you to Karen Jaster as well. Wonderful. She's incredible the work she does, and we never, not often, I shouldn't say never, not often enough do we acknowledge her work. Without her, we wouldn't be here today. And without her coordinating and making sure we're on track and getting us set up. So thank you so much, Karen. And also to Emmy Stravostan-Newells for helping us with the planning, for tapping us and saying, Stryker is the one on this one. So Emmy really put Stryker's name forward so graciously and eloquently, and is there with us, supporting us as we've had our Zoom here today. So thank you both, Emmy and Karen, for holding us together. Stryker can attest to that. We've had some meetings together as a group.
I
So
definitely needed their hand holding.
we definitely needed them. So thank you to both of you. If you enjoyed this lecture, please keep an eye on the JSGS events calendar where upcoming events and program information sessions are also being promoted. Karen will share the links in the chat, and please join me in a round of applause for our speaker and our planning committee, for Karen and Emmy, using our Zoom's reaction option. Thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to be able to do that hands clapping there myself. Thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much, Stryker, for taking the time to be with us. It was incredible.
It was my pleasure. And everybody, I hope you have a safe and wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.